Hey everybody, how's it going? Today I'm going to do a really quick demo on shading with pen. We're really going to focus on two shading techniques today. So you want to make sure that you have your artist pens ready. The first technique that we're going to do is called hatching. And this one consists of making a pattern of really thin lines. And remember that the closer together that your lines become, the darker the value becomes. So hatching, you're doing a series of these lines. And right now, these lines I'm creating right now, they're very sparse, which means that they're far apart. So that's a very light value. But as you bring them closer together, the value looks a little bit darker. So whenever you're doing any pen shading technique, you want to make sure that you're working with craftsmanship in mind. If you go too fast, your lines are going to look kind of scratchy. They're going to have weird little curves here and there. The ink isn't going to be as solid as you want it to be. So, take your time. The more you practice, the faster that you'll get and be able to make it look nice. So this first sphere that we're going to work on, let's imagine that the highlight is right here. Okay. And then we have our core shadow that wraps around there, okay? So I'm going to start with an 01 pen. I always like to start light. You can always go darker. You can always add more ink, but you cannot take the ink away. So I'm going to come on here onto my form. I'm going to start hatching around the edge of my sphere. And right now it doesn't look like too much, but we'll go back over in just a second. I'm leaving that little highlight area alone. Okay. So now we have like one layer of a midtone. Now I want it to get gradually darker as it gets closer to the bottom of the sphere. So I'm going to just add more marks, which increases the density of these lines. Remember that density means closer together, really close and tight. Okay, so as you can see, it's getting a little bit darker. Let's keep going. Now I'm going to focus more of my hatch marks around that core shadow area. Still working very carefully. And then if you feel like you need more in a certain area, you can always go back in and add more. And then I'm just going to erase the pencil that I originally had. So that's how hatching works. And then just to demo for you really quick what cross hatching means, that just means that not only are you moving in one direction with your pen, but you're also moving crisscross ways. This is just another way to cover up more of the paper to increase the density of the marks. So that's cross hatching. Hatching is when you only have lines going in one direction. And cross hatching is when you have lines going crisscross over each other. So that's what hatching is. The next technique that we're going to do is stippling. So stippling involves making a pattern of little dots or stipples. Now here they're really loose, but here I'm going to make them a little bit more dense. Just like with hatching, the closer together you make them, the darker the value is going to appear. So when I come up here on my sphere, that's where the highlight's going to be. This is where my core shadow is. I'm going to do a very loose pattern, very sparse pattern of dots out here, leaving the highlight alone because I want the lightest areas to not have any dots on them. Okay, and I'm going to do the same amount, the same sparsity level over our core shadow. And I'm going to start to make this more dense. So as I get closer, as the mid-tone gets closer to the core shadow, it's going to get gradually closer together. Remember, the key word here is gradual. You don't want to have too big of a jump between your lights and your darks. unless that's really what it looks like in your reference photo. But for the most part, value changes are very soft. Now you want to make sure that you're doing this, again, just like with hatching, slowly and carefully. If you go too fast, your dots are going to get these little, I call them shooting stars, where it has like a tail on the end of it. You don't want that. It just looks messy. It makes your artwork look like you rush through it very fast. So really take your time, hold your pen upright like this, and really commit to each mark that you're making. Now around here in the core shadow, I'm going to start stippling even denser. I'm still using the same amount of care. The more white of the paper that you cover up, the darker the value is going to be. Stippling does take longer than hatching because the value is built up out of these little tiny dots. However, the result is usually really beautiful as long as you take your time and really do it carefully. Now, one thing that you can do, right now I'm using an 01 pen. If you use the same weight of pen or the same size, that's okay. It will take longer. You could move to a bigger pen, for example, an 03. If you wanted to darken an area a little bit quicker, the 03 just has a bigger point size, so it's going to cover more of the surface of the paper a little bit faster. Gradually work up to pen sizes. You don't want to start with an 005 and then jump into an 08, for example. That would just go way too dark and the shadows would look kind of odd. There'd be like little teeny tiny dots scattered throughout, really big dots, and it just would kind of look a little bit messy. So just take your time. So that's stippling. And those are the two main pen shading techniques that I use. So experiment a little bit and just remember to always think about your craftsmanship. Now let's apply this to our Zentangle animal. So both of these right now, they have no pen shading on them. Okay. So for one of these, I'm going to add a little bit of shading. And to do that, I'm going to look at my reference photo. This one I drew on from when we did the cross contour lines over our animal. So just ignore all the arrows for right now. And I'm looking closely at where I see shadows and highlights happening. You can really start anywhere, but no matter where you start, just always start light. Remember, you can always add more ink. You can't take it away. So I'm going to go back into my 01 pen. And I'm going to start with around the muzzle area. So I feel like around the mouth here, it gets gradually a little bit darker. So I'm going to start with stipples. I really like using stipples for Zentangle animals. I think the shading is very subtle. Some areas, hatching is better. For example, on like areas that are really, really fluffy, like the ears, I noticed that there's a little patch of shadow right here. So I might come in here with hatching and very carefully and very gradually add some lines, and it'll kind of create a bit of a fur texture at the same time as creating some value. But areas that are not as hairy, maybe the fur is a little bit shorter, I personally like to use stippling. You could really do either for either area. What really matters is, are you doing it carefully? Because as long as you do it carefully and really be intentional with every mark that you make, you're going to get a nice result in the end. If you rush, it will pretty much always look messy. So I'm just doing a dot pattern, and you can already start to see the value forming here. Do some dots around here. And if you want something to be darker, just add more dots gradually to increase that density. Okay, so I'm really happy with that area. And now one thing I do want to show you guys is how you might use these techniques to do an eye. So let me go grab, actually, we'll just do an eye shape over here. on my sample paper. So let's say we have an eyeball. I don't know what animal this is. We'll just say that this is some kind of like red panda or something. Their eyes kind of look like this. Okay. And you've got the pupil. Okay. So with an animal like this, usually the area, look closely at your own reference photo, but usually the area immediately around the eye is solid black because they have that kind of tear duct area that's very dark. Unlike us, humans have like a pinkish tear duct area. A lot of animals just have solid black. So I'm just going to take my 05 pen and fill that whole area in. Now, before I start doing any shading on my eye, I do want to think about where the highlights might be. So look at your own reference photo, take your pencil, and then just trace around where the highlights are. I like to do this in pencil because I like to be able to erase the line around the highlight, because the highlight's a really light area. It doesn't have an outline around it. Now, if I were to stipple this, it's just the same process as stippling our sphere, for example. I'm actually going to do an 03 this time because this is a little bit of a bigger area. And if you're working on a big piece of paper, this is probably what you want to do too. First of all, I'm going to fill in the pupil black because I want that to really stand out. Okay. Now, for all the areas around it, usually around the top of the iris, that's the colored part of the eye, there'll be a shadow. The shadow is being cast from the eyelid. So I'll usually kind of start around that area and do a very loose dot pattern for stippling. And I'm not going to stipple over top of my highlight areas. I want to leave those empty. And I'm just going to go ahead and do a very sparse dot pattern everywhere else within the eye. Okay, now I want a little bit more value. Like I said, under the eyelid, it usually gets a little bit darker. So I'm going to gradually start to add more dense dots, not making it too dense yet. Because after you stipple for a little bit or hatch for a little bit, you want to kind of stop and reassess where you are. See, do I really need more? Does it look okay? Get back from it. Put your drawing up on the board and see, does it really need more value? And if it does, you can go ahead and continue. I'm going to add a little bit more, still working very carefully out here. And then I think I'm going to go even denser up here. I'm not really going into the 05 pen. I feel happy with the dot size or the point size that my 03 is giving me. Okay, and I think that that's a pretty effective eye. So then I go ahead and erase. And now you just have really nice highlights in your eye. Same process with hatching. I usually find that hatching, I prefer stippling for eyes because I think it gives just a softer gradient look, but you could do the same process with hatching as well. So those are 2 pen shading techniques. I hope you find this helpful and let me know if you have any questions.